4, 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We are on episode 72, I believe, of the Art of Move podcast with myself, Anthony Manuel, my good friend, Dr. William Raybar. We're out here in the Canadian Rockies, still trying to find the grand unified theory of human movement and biomechanics. Really stoked for another solo episode with Will today. And today we're going to be kind of diving into our series a little bit more on the philosophy of science as it pertains to discovering the truth of movement. So I'm very excited to have this conversation. Will, I know that there was a certain perspective that we wanted to adopt today, which I believe is kind of approaching the idea of paradigm shifting and a scientific revolution. Specifically, Thomas Kuhn, I believe, is the philosopher who you were citing, who had this idea of approaching a sort of breakthrough point in information, specifically within the culture of science. So how about we start with a fundamental overview of kind of what we're looking at, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so Thomas Kuhn is a philosopher, and he was looking at, or historian and philosopher, and he looked at how scientific paradigms changed, how science has changed throughout the ages and what happened. And he found it was more like, instead of linear, there was times where it was really a paradigm shift and then normal science, paradigm shift, normal science. And he literally called it normal science, right? Because that is what we were in for the longest time. Normal science. Everyone had the same hypothesis, working off the same concepts, methods. Everyone was happy. Now, I believe we're entering a crisis, and what he calls a crisis. Okay. And then from there, we can either go back to normal science, we can fix the crisis. Okay. And I think most people actually agree that there is a crisis going on from either end. Everyone's trying to fix it. It's just from what end are you trying to fix it? A lot of people are saying, let's do more science, better peer review. Better randomized control trials will bring us what we need. Others say, no, we need a whole different perspective change. And then that also brings up the, like, what are we actually trying to change here? Is it all of science? Is it just the movement field? For now, I'm going to talk about the movement field, right? But a lot of this extrapolates to, kind of everything, right? So again, there's pre-paradigm, there is normal science, there is crisis, and then there's scientific revolution. Now, you don't have to get to scientific revolution. You can go back to normal science again, but sometimes it gets there, and that's when major paradigm changes have happened, right? So I'm going to actually play a little clip from Thomas Kuhn to lay out the overall foundation for this, and then we can dive into each of those epochs and see where today's movement field is and what the arguments are and who's saying what, and why I argue that we're in a crisis right now, okay? And preceding a possible scientific revolution, but we shall see. So I'm going to play Thomas Kuhn, and this is from the University of Leiden University Faculty of Philosophy. Okay, so I'm going to play this here, and he's going to talk about Thomas Kuhn and the structure of science.
An American physicist, historian, and philosopher of science developed an extremely influential account of science, according to which the idea that science is critical is mostly an illusion. Or to be more precise, it is an illusion most of the time. Most of the time, Kuhn argues, science isn't very critical at all. It's only at specific and exceptional moments in history that science becomes critical. So if we believe that science is always critical, we are mistaking the exception for the rule. In these lectures, we're going to delve into that. Kuhn's theory is based on his own work as a historian of science. When Kuhn studied the history of science, he didn't see a chaotic succession of events. Instead, what he saw was a kind of pattern of alternating phases, of different kinds of science that happened at different moments and which followed each other in a standard way. According to Kuhn, you could see this pattern everywhere, in all the sciences, or at least all the natural sciences, and throughout history. So, what are the phases that Kuhn identified? There is first the pre-paradigmatic phase, and I'm going to explain the meaning of these terms later on. Second, there is the phase that Kuhn calls normal science. Third, there is the phase of crisis. And fourth, there is the phase of scientific revolution. Every science, Kuhn tells us, starts in a pre-paradigmatic phase. At some point, it will move on to the phase of normal science. Once that has happened, that scientific discipline will never return to the first phase. So pre-paradigmatic science happens only once for any scientific discipline. The other three phases, however, will occur many times. From a phase of normal science, we can move to a phase of crisis. From a phase of crisis, we will return either to normal science or go on to a scientific revolution. And from the phase of scientific revolution...
Okay, so that's pretty interesting, eh? Like before that, your volume.
I just said it's super interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, basically before that, Karl Popper was very popular, and that was, we can, he's basically saying that science changes in a linear fashion, okay, based on deductive and inductive reasoning, mostly falsification of theories, right? Where Thomas Kuhn really summed it up into, actually, it's better organized in pre-paradigm, normal science, crisis, and scientific revolution, right? So it's actually very interesting, and let's take a look at each and just what normal science actually is, right? So again, I think we were in the phase of normal science up until, maybe 5 years ago, maybe 2 years ago, some would say, right? Where the public and even scientists within science have started to question models, and you can start seeing it everywhere, right? So it's just a matter of how they're questioning the models that are currently there. Of course, in our field, an easy example would be the head over foot with WEC, right? So the head over foot is challenging the spine straight model. And you can really see head over foot in footage everywhere. Even SMU's Motor Lab has the head over foot motions in their 3D analysis, right? But they won't say head over foot, and they won't say that the spine has a sway because it's not currently within their model. So within normal science, in their paradigm, there's no place for this conversation. So they don't even see it, or they can't see it or talk about it, because they would be the first.
We can kind of define normal science then as people building hypotheses within a model framework of a current assumption about the way things work. So it might not even be necessarily even a first principles change. It could be, like a third principle down the line kind of thing, like the pedestrian theory of locomotion. The spine is rigid and stiff and stable and stays as a central passive column as, the limbs guide your locomotion. That's the pedestrian theory of locomotion. And then I guess WEC would be the spinal engine theory of locomotion, right? Normal science would be like you have a specific model and you're testing variables within the model, built upon the model. Is that kind of what we're looking at? So normal science basically assumes certain principles and then will base hypotheses based on the assumptions. This is why I guess pre-science and pre-paradigm kind of mindset exists, is because the paradigm hasn't been established yet. Then you have both empirical and scientific and deductive data that will help form a paradigm based on consensus among different scientific minds. And then from there, you have this sort of phase of information gathering as it pertains to a certain scientific field, which we call normal science. That's kind of what I'm understanding so far.
Yeah, I mean, that's all correct, right? And if I wanted to sum it up easily, it's the scientists share concepts, theories, methods, and models, and they draw upon the same ones, and that's why they can communicate, right? So, someone like Goda or functional patterns comes in, starts using different languages, that would drive the current paradigm or the normal science crazy, because they are coming in with where I would label it as a pre-paradigm in this model, and Kuhn's model, pre-paradigm thinking, where concepts, theories, and methods aren't shared. Language isn't shared, or is less than optimally shared, let's say, right? Because you've seen the language barriers there between how Goda and even like WEC uses language. It just doesn't fit with normal science. Now, most people in the same normal science are solving the same puzzles in the same rules in the same field, right? So they share the fact that they're all trying to solve the same thing, okay? And it's a set of assumptions that you don't really learn about in school. Like when I was there learning the assumptions that we learned, or I shouldn't even say assumptions, the theories that we were learning, I just thought they were the best theories. I'm like, this is it. This is the pinnacle of what humanity has, because I'm getting it and it's from the best institution. So it has to be the science, right? But I didn't know I was operating within a paradigm. There was never any philosophical discussion about how to arrive to a conclusion of or how to arrive at a paradigm, or how we did arrive at the paradigm. There was an overarching story, that's like Newton to Einstein and Copernicus, and we figured out that we revolve around the sun, right? So there was those overarching stories, but never honing in on where the paradigm comes from. Okay, so I think that we're using a lot of models that are very assumptive, and rarely are first principles questioned within normal science. That's the whole point of normal science. That's where we've been, and that's why it's very hard for people to come to terms with, how are you even in this conversation if I'm coming from outside the randomized controlled world, right? Because that is the paradigm operated within for everybody operating within the research-based paradigm, right? So it's a very interesting dilemma. However, back in Kuhn's time and throughout history, and like Steph said the other day, there was a class of people who had the upper hand by knowing Latin and learning within the institution. So it was really held by a class of people who were intelligent nobility, right? And today that is, the institution. And there's never been an internet. There's never been an internet age where information is flying so fast amongst, the class of people who wouldn't have access to this information before. And again, it's bringing these problems that, the modern day problems of what you see. Charlatanism could be a thing, right? People just putting things on the internet. That is the problem with it. The good part is the information flows super fast, but it doesn't exactly fit this Kuhn cycle either, right? So it's a very interesting new problem that we have, and we have to face it.
Well, I mean, if you're looking at the Kuhn cycle, and you start from normal science to a model drift, right? And I like this term. I like the term model drift because we're looking at a divergence from current models. And that's what you see with some of the more innovative functional movement-based training systems, is that they're creating new models. And it's funny because it's a drift and not necessarily like this hard shift, because they're still operating on different fundamental principles of mechanics. They're still operating under principles of certain biological functions, and there are parts that overlap with existing models of how the body works and how the body functions and how the body is. That being said, there are fundamental differences in how they interpret the meanings of those models and how they interconnect, right? And so a new model can form from a different interpretation of some existing paradigms and existing principles, but being able to approach them in a different way and being able to observe something different and question. I think there is also a benefit. We kind of talked about this a little bit, about coming from outside of an academic perspective, where you are not I'm going to say indoctrinated with the current normal science, with the current paradigm of understanding and the current set of first principles, because oftentimes we don't even realize how much we have to assume in order to ascertain a certain level of scientific understanding when it comes to a set of paradigms, right? It's very interesting, the idea of like, well, it's hard to pinpoint where a certain paradigm came from, because realistically, if you're thinking about scientific consensus over time, there's going to be an amalgamation of different opinions and observations and scientific data that's going to create a broad overarching story. However, if you get one principle that is divergent or really, really strong that is wrong, like an incorrect first principle. So I think of the diet heart hypothesis that Ansel Keys purported, that basically saturated fat is correlated to heart disease, and that affected an entire field of nutritional studies. I think about the pedestrian theory of locomotion versus the spinal engine, where now you're not looking at the fluidity of movement as it pertains to locomotion, and you're not looking at the dynamics of rotary and lateral bending components of the spine in movement, and you're thinking only in terms of stability. Now, what does that do to how you're studying the information? Well, now if your core has to stay rigid, now all of a sudden it's about force production. So force production becomes this main area of focus for movement. And again, things like fluidity, things like elastic recoil, things like fascial quality, these things are put by the wayside because they're not considered. You can't see them. You have these horse blinders on for your own first principles. So the model drift, it seems like, is when you identify a difference in first principles, maybe not even first principles, maybe you just identify a difference in a model that is not necessarily working. Maybe you're seeing some pieces of the puzzle that don't actually fit together because you're operating on the wrong puzzle, right? And so that's the model drift to me is kind of when you get people who might not even be within the academic circles who recognize an issue with some of the first principles, and they start to question it, and they start to develop, do things like develop their own language to discuss the phenomenon that they're observing, that they're the only ones that can see, because they're not with the horse blinders on of the other narrative and the other first principle.
It's a very interesting point you just brought up, because you said from outside of, the paradigm, outside of the science, that was never allowed in the past, right? So you had to be within the science, and that back in the day, it wasn't, papers that would bring you in and institutions. It would be, a set of, like Steph said, it was basically a set of aristocracy that was very intelligent, that shared and had a culture of science, right? So now it's the peer-reviewed science, and there's never been a time where outsiders in the recent past have come in with a theory and been allowed to share. You have to enter the field, right? So by far, it's mostly PhDs, master students. That's who's doing this research, right? And it, especially our field in the biomechanics. And again, that we have to separate biomechanics, and what we do is more applied biomechanics. We're the testers. We're trying things out. And it becomes weird for us, or for me, where it's like, I know this research-based paradigm, and what I'm doing is exploring movement, and a lot of it makes sense mechanically, scientifically, right? And I'm like, why don't you just think of this like mechanics? Why do you need a research paper? Because mechanics are scientific, right? If I see a collapse in my rib cage in one side, I'm going to assume there's more pressure on that side, right? Like, that is a mechanical principle. But for some reason, that's not allowed in the peer review, or it doesn't fit in the peer review model because it's not in a paper, right? And that leads to another point. It's basically, there's always anomalies in a paradigm, in models, and that's okay with people as long as they can believe, and scientists, I should say, as long as they believe and trust that they can solve it in the future. Okay, but when the observations start not fitting for a long period of time, anomalies start to build, then the trust starts to go down from within the field. Okay, and I see a lot of these, research-based chiros physios that are at that point where they're like, you know what, I don't trust the theories so much because it's watered down. There's a lot of crap going around within, woo-woo magic. If I touch you, you're better type of thing. So, and in biomechanics, it's like, we can't even decide, and I'm talking about the scientific research field, we can't even decide whether to lift with our backs rounded, if that's a bad thing, a good thing, if it applies more pressure onto the disc or it doesn't. I was taught it did, period. And now people are like, no, it doesn't, right? So, and you can find both camps. So really, it's people trying to solve from within the system, and they're trying to solve with more peer review, harder peer review, better peer review. It's time to clean this up. But this is my hypothesis, when the cleaning is all done and it's almost done, there's still going to be the issue, because the actual issue is that we're not treating people with love and like humans. Okay, if I have a human being in front of me and I want the best treatment for the person, I'm not going to have a rigid box of, let's say, problems that I have defined in my head. And that's the diagnosis model, right? Like, I must diagnose somebody with a problem. This is talking my therapist lens right now, right? Somebody must be diagnosed. There must be a physical ailment with you that is within the biomedical model, period. By law, like, I have to diagnose you, right? Like, so I'm operating under that paradigm, both mentally and within a constraint of risk, litigation, and safety for the populace, right? But did you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I guess and it's funny because I can see the issue, the dilemma of having again, we talked about the idea of safety versus innovation and versus spontaneity and an intuitive approach, right? There's this idea that, like, the more you systematize something and the more standardized you make it, the safer in theory it can become, because you have, well, statistically speaking, this is going to help the 7 out of 10 people, and that's a pretty good rate, and we can't actually quantify an intuitive person's approach. And the other thing is, how do you test whether a person is competent at providing loving and effective healthcare? Just because you treat someone like a human being, do you have the capacity and the skill and the know-how and the wherewithal to actually treat someone effectively while treating them like a human being? You might see them as a human being, but how do you create a consistent quality of care amongst many practitioners? So you have this fundamental issue of, yes, scientific data is going to help create a more consistent standard because it's reductionist. It's here are the variables, here are the the circumstances, here are the unique circumstances that you're going to do. Let's break down the variables, let's test it, and now if you do this way, then you're going to have a higher chance of success than if you were just intuitively doing something. Now, that being said, I know for myself, having worked as a personal trainer for quite a long time, I could work out knots in people's bodies by intuitively doing myofascial release, applying pressure, using certain exercises. I could fix people's problems, not because I had a standardized method of care, but because I was looking at the person, looking at the problem. I did have a rudimentary understanding of the human structure, of anatomy, of mechanics, and I was able to apply certain tools and certain basically circumstantial things that weren't necessarily taught to me in a certification program, in a university degree, in a peer-reviewed paper. And that's not to say I didn't read a ton of peer-reviewed papers, because to me it's like, okay, if I have more data, I have more information, then intuitively I'll be able to apply that to a certain scenario and I have a human being in front of me. It's not that we're necessarily against scientific methods of deducing certain things for variables and having that be a bigger part of the picture, a bigger part of when you're standing in front of a human being. I just don't think that applying the reductionist view of standardizing everything to the exact measure, of reducing everything to just certain variables and testing the wrong variables as it pertains to movement. This is the other thing, right? When we're talking about there's a fundamental issue with the first principles, you're going to test the wrong variables. You're going to get the wrong information anyway. It could be the best science in the world. It could show you the exact data points, but you're still measuring the wrong shit.
Such a good point, right? That reminds me of the WEC SMU lab footage.
Yeah.
Do you have that up by any chance?
I'll pull that up right now. Keep talking.
Pull it up, because it really does say something that I've had this argument. Get this argument, okay? I argued for Goda's thought process of looking at the pool of data out there, thousands and thousands of people shredding their knees, their Achilles, and whatnot, right? Like injuries that you can find just open source on the internet, right? And it shows you different ages, different variables, different different scenarios that people are in where they have the same injury, so you can draw upon a huge pool of data, right? But the problem there is that basically that the argument against that was that we have 3D cameras in labs, PhDs with 3D cameras, so they'll be able to see what Goda can't see. How can 2D on screen be better than 3D in a lab? It's impossible. 3D is better. But it goes back to the argument of you not even knowing what you're looking at. If you're looking at it from side view, this man is going to look like he's flexing and extending and bobbing up and down. But if you look at it from the front and back, he's clearly moving his head over his foot, like Weck said, and the spine is moving from side to side. Okay, so they couldn't see it, or they didn't talk about it and they saw it because it's not within the models or concepts right now. Okay, and there's your problem. It's like someone from the outside, Weck, is going, look, guys, the emperor or the king wearing clothes here. Okay, and nobody wants to address it. And I've heard arguments against it, like, no, the head actually stays within the foot, and if it goes, or that they strawman Weck and say the head's supposed to go way out and it's this crazy sway that Weck is espousing. And you know what? Once you get good at it, you can start playing with that, but that's not what it is. Balance is head over foot, and the body kind of does it naturally because it's a balance point. Your body, tries to find balance points, right? And it's an athletic motion. If you're athletic, you're probably going to be in balance, right? So more athletic people are going to have this sway, except that we like to look at 100 meters, one move explosive guys, and they don't have to do this because after the one move explosivity, you can just chill. And that, you know what I mean? Like the actual best movers are fluid, in my opinion, and you can see it many, many, many places in slow motion, and even at a accredited lab, one of the best labs in the world with 3D equipment, and they're not saying anything about it. No one's addressing this.
For those who don't know what a one move explosive guy is, by the way, it's like if you're on Instagram and you see a guy ripping a medicine ball against the wall and then turning and doing a sprint for like a few yards. It's literally that. It's like one move, one hard change of direction, and then an explosive burst of movement. Sometimes there's not even a change of direction. Sometimes it's just like you're jumping onto a box really, really fast from your knees. And it's literally, it's one move, usually lasting 1 to 5 seconds at the most. And even 5 seconds is a long time. And it's supposed to be this incredible display of athleticism, but all it is this like unique contextual, one-off situation that's predicated around, again, force production and power output.
Exactly. And this becomes awkward here, right? Because according to Kuhn, I think, Weck's theory here, head over foot, since it doesn't fit in the normal science, it would, be considered pre-paradigm, or what I would think, right? Where he doesn't share the concept with most of the scientific community, if not all of it, right? So it becomes awkward because then you have technologies that caught up with, the models that say it's incorrect, and I can watch it in slow-mo constantly. I put it on my stories every single day. I watch it in slow motion. I watch it happen. I do it on myself, but yet I'm told it's not there. So it's just a weird scenario for 2022.
Well, I would almost call it more of a model drift, right? And I think the model drift is where, certain people start questioning aspects of a model. And then maybe the model crisis before the pre-revolution, when you hit that crisis point, is when enough people are questioning it. And maybe it goes from from outside of the scientific paradigm to inside the scientific paradigm. Then you have people within academia questioning the first principles, and you have a crisis of the model where it's like, oh shit, we have this first principle, it's wrong. It has, the idea reaches a critical mass, which again, critical crisis, you get the model crisis, the critical mass causes the model crisis. And that's where you start to experience people remodeling the paradigm.
It's interesting what you're saying there, because I think that they don't get to first principles. That's the whole point. That's the heart of it, right? We know something's wrong. Let's fix it. Right now, it's like, let's toss out all this really bad peer-reviewed study, because even within peer review now, like the top guys who are like, we want to fix the science, they're tossing out peer review like crazy, because they're like, this is bad peer review. It's from really poorly done research, bad journals, or predatory journals is what they call them, right? And it's just
journals.
Yeah, so like there's journals that just have no standards, right?
Right.
And that's what would be called predatory journals within a research-based paradigm. It could be a good journal, but it just doesn't have the standards of a rigorous journal like, Nature, Lancet, British Medical Journal, those prestigious, right? They're peer-reviewed. They have the best peer review. They have only the top information makes it there. If your information makes it there, you're famous. You're now a really good researcher, right? So everyone's vying for that title, but basically everyone's looking at how to fix it in a crisis. I think that's where we're at, right? They try to amalgamate ideas. I can't remember which philosopher said that was going to happen, but basically ideas are starting to amalgamate from previous ideas. Again, I'm going to go back to Pat Davidson's galaxy theory of movement. It's like, it's head over foot in spirals, guys. Head over foot in spirals. And like, I can show you on slow-mo. That's the thing. The technology's new. It's a new paradigm in terms of, in my mind already, right? But it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out, because is the science going to keep its original structure, are the people just going to keep doing their thing anyway? And there's going to be a parallel between science and, what science would call probably what we're doing, bro science, right? Which it's completely false, right? I'm working on scientific principles, just not hard peer review as my number one first principle, right? So, and it's my assertion that the first principles that are being used right now by scientists, by the vast majority of scientists, are peer review, randomized controlled trials with perfect subgroups would be the optimal way to go upon science. If you had a twin, if we all had twins and we could study the twin, then everyone would know, that would be the optimal thing, right? So do you get what I'm saying? Like if everyone had a twin, that's the best study there. Oh, he's just like him genetically, but environmentally they grew up slightly different. So there's your variation. I don't even believe that model really, but I mean, that's how it goes now, right? So right now people are going to start looking outside the box. Even from within science, they're going to start questioning models from within, but it's really hard to get to those first principles. And it's a touchy situation when you start getting closer and closer to the first principle. Nobody wants to touch that. And everyone has to do it at the same time. Otherwise, it's a crabs in the bucket type thing, right? If you go after a first principle, like I'm doing right now, there's going to be people coming after you eventually, like, you're this, you're that, ad hominem. It's like, I'm open to discussion and debate about this. But we have to be honest about our first principles, I think, right? Yeah. Do you believe this? Or are you what theory are you basing this upon is really the questioning that I want to get to when people come on now. I've thought of this consciously, right? Like, where did you get that model and why do you believe it? Right?
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Some of the stuff that you said kind of reminded me of earlier part of the conversation where we were talking about how prior there was this academic elite that you would go to a university and you would actually learn Latin, that you could access this information that other people didn't even speak the same language. At one point, science was even a different language, this language of Latin. And now you contrast that with, having this academic elite that literally you learn a magical language that can allow you to access this cult knowledge, this hidden knowledge of science. Now you have PubMed. Now you have the ability to watch countless hours of slow motion video. You can observe things that you would never be able to observe because you have infinite access to information, essentially. And the information has been democratized. It's become open platform, and being able to go yourself as a layman and scour PubMed, it's a good thing and it's a dangerous thing, right? Because on one hand, maybe you don't have the rigorous understanding of how to read science. Maybe you don't know how to interpret data. Maybe you don't know what some of the information that you're acquiring from PubMed actually means. And I have actually been guilty of that when I was doing a lot of nutrition research. I put like over 15,000 hours of researching nutrition, trying to figure out what works. And, at the end of that 15,000 hours, all I had was like, I still don't know anything, right? Because I was misinterpreting data and I kept finding things that contradicted it. And I stopped paying attention to also the reality of what would happen when I ate certain foods in favor of data. And arguments and really, really well thought out logical arguments. I let go of the empiricism of my own experience and only looked at data. And so there's this incredible thing where now you have people who are not part of an intellectual elite who can access these swaths of data and can make their own observations. And a lot of these people are just people who are in the trenches and doing this stuff. A lot of the people who are making the observations, like right now there's a Twitter debate going on with Brandon Pigg and Mike Boyle and a few other strength coaches, where Brandon is a strength and conditioning coach and kind of asserted, it's like, I'm noticing that the more that people improve their back squat, the slower and less coordinated they are. And there's this idea that you have to get much stronger in order to get faster. And if you get bigger and stronger, then you'll be faster and you'll be a better athlete. But I'm noticing that's not true. And so and it's funny because I saw him, he's like, okay guys, I caved. I bought Wex propulsors, and he's talking about different ideas of locomotion now. And, he actually had this really funny tweet where he was using like Dragon Ball Z as an example.
Who's this? Mike
And
Boyle?
no, this is Brandon Pigg, and Mike
Brandon
Boyle
Pigg.
kind of disagreed with him. He had a few people
Okay,
disagreeing with him, but he had this analogy. He's like, the first time Goku went Super Saiyan 2, he told Gohan he wouldn't use it because being bigger and stronger is an automatic L if you go slower. Trunks tried it. He took a big fat L. Gohan figured how to get bigger, stronger, and faster. This tweet isn't about Dragon Ball Z. And it's kind of this idea, like, he doesn't think necessarily that you can't get faster while also getting bigger and stronger, but he's questioning the ways that people are getting bigger and stronger as it pertains to athletics. Whereas the golden cow of a lot of strength and conditioning is, if you see the number on your squat go up, you're going to be stronger, you'll have better force output, your sprints will be better, your whatever will be better. Mike Boyle also, in his defense, said, powerlifters don't actually make great sprinters, so it isn't actually that correlated. It's probably more complicated than that. And yet at the same time, these people have this awareness, this like broad awareness, but there's still this horse blinder thing of like, strength is speed, is athleticism, right? Like there's this idea that people are using the one tool for all these different applications because they have this singular focus forward.
Yeah, it's interesting, and that brings up another point of how people get the information, or how the information is brought down to the average trainer, let's say, like a trainer on the floor. Okay, so you have your PhDs who do research, and clinicians do as well, but it's mostly PhDs and master students in universities doing the vast majority of research, right? And a lot of them have, and let's say Stu McGill compiles his research and he does seminars. As a student, I went to McGill's seminar, right? I'm learning all his info. Oh, this, pertains great to my practice. And in his paradigm, it's a very lifting paradigm. He's solving the problems of lifting and then extrapolating them to, it'll work out with everyone in rehab. More strength, more stability. Here's how you stabilize when someone's already injured. Here's what happens to the disc when you move it. And it's very lifting paradigm focused. The models are lifting, but not everybody lifts. Not everybody has to lift. Okay. It's such a horse blinders mentality of lifting will solve your problem. Lifting is not a natural thing in terms of like barbell training in a gym. It's so apparent. You have to move your body for the rest of your life, right? So it's very honed in and very focused in on lifting, solving the problem. But that in itself is a paradigm. That in itself is an assumption that actually works. But you'll see as we unpack this series that we don't actually have any long-term studies on this stuff. We don't know that much about it. Within the scientific camps, they're arguing like crazy. They can't figure anything out. If one guy tells you, a McGill guy says that he hasn't figured out that McGill is the guru, McGill is the guy, the next guy will tell you, no, it's not McGill. It's whatever, Adam Meekins or someone, I shouldn't even say him because he's not a PhD, but somebody who says the counter argument from McGill within the institutions. So there's a robust debate, but there's a consensus that we don't know that much. Okay. And so what do you do when you're within the paradigm? What you do is, biomechanics is equivocal, so let's throw out biomechanics. That's basically what's being done by a lot of the people trying to clean it up right now. We haven't found anything in biomechanics. Trust me, guys, there's nothing there. But that's within your own paradigm. That's the actual issue, right? And then now we have these people on the ground, they're kind of like martial artists. If it works, keep it going. So it is not scientific in the sense that we have a collection of data, but it's scientific in that it can be taught to people very easily. Okay. I shouldn't even say that's scientific. It is more humane. We can teach people how to move much better. And again, back to biomechanics and pain science, they say your movement doesn't have anything to do with pain, which of course they're in their studies, their movements that they study are just way off. They're in the linear plane, ranges of motion. The body is a robot type thing. It's like, no, that's not how it works. It's an energy wave. Back to the first, pre-paradigm thing that I was talking about. Now I'm saying energy wave. They won't have any idea what I'm talking about because it is a linear system.
Well, it's funny because I don't think we're not in pre-paradigm anymore. Pre-paradigm only happens once in a scientific field, right? So
Yeah.
we're existing, like the mainstream consensus is a certain paradigm, and what you're talking about now is a model shift, right? And like we're shifting away from the model into a new understanding of biomechanical principles. And if you change a biomechanical principle, then all the other principles and variables that you're testing now all of a sudden fall under more intense scrutiny, because it's not relevant anymore. You know, you're fundamentally making a lot of research, even if it's good research within the current paradigm, irrelevant, because it's looking at a different first principle. If you're and it's interesting that we got to this, like we're on episode 72, and I was thinking like our first few episodes were outlining the differences that we see in biomechanics versus mainstream biomechanics. Now we're talking about movement science as a whole. Right? We're literally talking about movement science as a whole. And it's interesting that they're just throwing away the biomechanical differences, because in that it sounds like, well, no, biomechanics is a fixed idea. So how do you get from this model shift where it's like, okay, we acknowledge that there's an energy wave that travels up this kinetic chain and this fascial loading and you know, load and release situation. How do we get from that idea, shifting away from a model, to where there's a model crisis and an eventual revolution of ideas?
Yeah, again, the model crisis is happening right now. People are poking obvious holes in the model, and again, this doesn't work like it did before in Kuhn's time, right? Like we have technology, we have information sharing that goes very, very fast. You know what I mean? Like when there's an injury that happens in the NFL, you'll have 20 go-to coaches breaking it down within, you know, an hour and then sharing it real quick, right? That's unscientific to the scientific community. They'll just throw that away. That's, you know, your average Joe, just, you know, soccer dad or football dad just trying to do slow-mo on his phone. That's what they would equivocate that to, right? To me, the models are just being poked from the outside so hard. And for me personally, I've been in both worlds, so I can see, I'm like, they're just not going to accept the, you know, let's say fascia, for instance. This is a good example. Okay. I was told fascia doesn't have anything to do with movement, or like you shouldn't have to account for fascia because it doesn't do that much. They say it doesn't do that much. Okay. They call it connective tissue. That's fine. Okay. Where they really start to understand the force is when the muscle goes into the tendon. That's as much as they're willing to admit now, right? Because the mathematical models that they use to calculate force vectors don't account for anything but levers and muscles pulling. They don't account for the fascia, so they can't have it in the model, so it doesn't exist. Except that we have a whole nother branch of science that's new, that's uncovering fascia, that's doing work upon, you know, what receptors it has, the tensile strength, the applications within movement, the applications within sports. So denying that it exists isn't a good idea.
Nope.
Trying to apply it in your own model is going to be very hard because you haven't admitted that you'll now have to reaccount for the force and movement, which when it starts to become elastic and connective, levers no longer apply. The levers are easy to account for. It's like a bodybuilding paradigm. That's why I was taught in university. It's like levers and movements. If you hit every muscle, you will be healthy, right? So that is a example of the old model. We need to be in with the new. We need to bring fascia into the play. We need to understand that the body moves in synchronicities, or not synchronicities, but a symphony of rotary movements. Okay. The spine does move from side to side. If you allow it, it will bring you better movement. Okay. The body does land in a bow and leaves in a corner. You know what I mean? Like a go to observation. Okay. Yeah. What that means and how that works, that's up for interpretation still. Okay. Mm-hmm. We can design studies around that. However, my assertion is this is much better than side view assessment of the gait, which is, I've been told that, oh, it's not only side view, it's back and forth too. We accounted for everything. We have 3D motion cameras. Of course we've seen it, but you're not accounting for it in your theories and models. Therefore, you can't account for it mathematically. Therefore, when your papers come out and the conclusions come out, you can draw upon the conclusions, but let's take a look at the methods section because the method sections aren't that good. Okay. And they're not accounting for enough variables. And the RCT is limiting in the way you account for variables. Right now, we have better technology. We can look at open source, many different fields, get the injury data, and we can talk about it amongst scientists too. Why not, right? You're not even acknowledging, the science isn't even acknowledging that that's a thing. You can do it within science too. But then again, that goes back to everybody has to do it at once type thing. Because if you start doing it, people will single you out.
And I think one of the obstacles when you're talking about shifting a paradigm is you brought up the example of the person who said he had a paper that he was sitting on for a long time because he was afraid of all the backlash that he would get because it went against the model, where it's like, oh, you guys can relax your core and move your spine a little bit when you run. Everyone's like, you're so brave for coming out. That's an issue. But the other issue is when you're talking about cross communication between the academic community and the people who are more democratized in their information and are more discussing ideas amongst themselves outside of an academic framework, is that the evidence-based crowd, and here's the thing is anytime there's an us and them, us versus them paradigm, there's not going to be productive conversation. I really wanted our podcast to be a place where there would be productive cross conversation amongst people within the functional fitness community. And I think we've achieved that pretty well. I mean, we've had David Weck on, we've had Goda on, we've had Naudi Aguilar on, we've had like a lot of different people from different systems who have historically fought amongst themselves. And we've managed to create some degree of cross communication, and you're seeing it grow more and more the more that the conversation opens up. Now that's only within functional fitness. When we're talking about within the scientific community, within the evidence-based crowd, they have an issue where there's a lot of infighting. I wanted this podcast to kind of end the infighting within functional fitness first. And there always will be, because people are going to disagree about ideas, and there will always be, and that's good. We don't want everyone agreeing with each other. We just want civility in the conversation and to progress forward with better ideas, ultimately. Now, that has to happen not just within the infighting groups of like the evidence-based crowd are fighting with each other about different ideas within their paradigm, and then the functional fitness-based crowd are infighting over their ideas, but trying to get them to converse together is totally different because you're operating from different paradigms, right? Like both Goda and David Weck and even Naudi can agree that you need your weight centered over your foot when you run. Head over foot is a reality. Goda calls it columns. Weck calls it head over foot. Naudi doesn't give it a name publicly because but he demonstrates it in his running. And in the people who are doing functional patterns, they demonstrate the spinal wave and the tensegrity therein. Now, the issue is you have the evidence-based crowd saying what you're doing is unscientific and it's not valid and it's dumb and you're dumb. And then the alternative thought, functional fitness, practical applied biomechanics crowd is saying, well, you aren't actually doing any of this stuff. You're dumb. You're just looking at data. You're not actually doing any of this stuff. You aren't even acknowledging anything. So a person who's in applied biomechanics is going to see science, and going through the academia is a big waste of time because it's a propaganda machine basically saying you will get educated and be a part of this crowd if you go through the rigors of learning, all of the current paradigm and learn this 4-year degree, however many years of a degree that you have to take in order to even participate in the conversation. Someone who's doing applied biomechanics isn't going to fucking do that. They aren't, because they're too busy getting results with their clients. They're too busy learning and experimenting and applying. They don't want to waste time by slowing down the discoveries that they're making and the results that they're getting. Yeah. Conversely, someone within the scientific community isn't going to do it because they just invested 8, 10 something years of their lives to get a PhD that is predicated on a certain base of information and a certain paradigm. So how are we going to start getting that cross communication? That's something that I'm kind of interested in.
Yeah, it's very hard, as you can see, right? Like people don't want to talk to each other. I don't know, to be honest. I don't know, other than just keep going with what we're doing and see how that plays out, right? I'm just going to continue to call it like I see it. And I have a pretty unique insight into the scientific world, the research-based world. And I've recently become interested because this is a whole world that I kind of left a while ago. I realized myself, because again, the way I practice, I spend an hour with each patient. I'm mitigating the problems of not being patient-centered or person-centered, because realistically, most people spend 10 to 15 minutes with a patient, or, a physio does that. That's pretty much the standard, 15, 20 minutes. How could you start connecting with someone within that time frame? However, you're in a busy city clinic, you're running from room to room. Like, that's the realities of situations, right? So that in itself, being more patient-centered, you're going to have to charge more money. And I'm talking on the therapist end, you're going to have to charge more money, but you're going to have to also get your skills up, get your communication skills up, get
marketing.
You like in a tribe, let's say we're in a tribe, there would be like a medicine man, someone who's better at other people when tending to their wounds, like understanding intuitively what a person in pain is doing. I know people like this. I'm a natural, I'm not sure, but I definitely know naturals at this who just know how to tend to care, right? Tend to people, tend to animals even. You'll see these people tend to animals, right? So, and again, that's unscientific, but it's something I've observed, okay? And to me, that's more along the person who should go into a patient-centered job, right? Like if you can recognize this in your kids or as you're young, it would be a good idea, right? Because you actually will love what you do and you will want to communicate person to person. You're not going to want to jump from room to room for 10 minutes. You're not going to want to put dry needles in someone and run over to the next room and thump somebody. And this is the realities, right? And I go over and crack somebody over here. And this is the reality of a lot of city clinics that are busy. And to be honest, a lot of people aren't even in the conversation on that end of it, right? It really is the people that care that are in the conversation. And a lot of people that care, unfortunately, are on the opposing end of where I'm at in terms of wanting to go harder with the science, more lockdown on the information. You can't say that because that's not scientifically rigorous, right? According to the science that I espouse. So I want to lobby to get you to not say that anymore on Facebook, right? So that is the issue that's going to come up, right? So what do we want in the future? Do we want to have a therapist or therapists out there who kind of like work under the medical model under a very, very strict controlled, do no harm first type of society where you're going to get the best of the research-based information? At this point isn't very good in my opinion. Or I shouldn't say very good. It's like nobody can agree, right? But again, they don't want to tell you that. They like anybody in their own little field, like the guys who say you can lift whatever way you want, movement optimism guys, they're not going to say that there's a better way to move than another way, right? They're not going to entertain that idea because movement optimism says that as long as you load yourself below your capacity, you can adapt. To me, there's better ways to move than others, clearly, right? Martial application, actually getting out and applying it. So again, our field is more like martial arts, learning almost like the UFC, where you're starting to put things together and we'll see what works better, right? Versus going into a fight with a peer review. I think I should throw the peer review science says that throwing a straight right with a left afterwards is more successful 59% of the time. So I'm going to do that instead of a hook uppercut, which is only 20% successful, but you forgot to see the situation in front of you first, right? So that's a whole thing. There's not really an account for seeing the situation in front of you, right? I'm going to tell a little story or like how it works. So when you're research-based clinician, you're looked upon by the research-based world as a good clinician. And that means that when you have a diagnosis, you also have a high percentage thing to go to, a treatment to go to, because it's been researched. It's the research-based treatment for a certain diagnosis. You have a protocol. Now, in reality, a lot of the research-based people do follow it, but there's always a variable that the patient doesn't fit into the group that you studied. Right? So putting that rigid intervention into the person in front of you who doesn't exactly fit that study, does that make sense? 100%? No, it doesn't. But they say it's the best way to do it. So We're just going to have to do it that way. But as a practitioner, there's always I can go, there's a gray area here because this person isn't exactly who was studied, right? So I know through my intuition and through my experience that I should do this instead, right? So even the most research-based guys are still operating there, right? They still have to make those slight tweak and adjustments. So where's the line? Where's the line here, right? Like how rigid are you going to be in those interventions? My hypothesis is if you're too rigid, you're forgetting about the person in front of you because it's not about that. That is not even accounted for in the RCT. Where there's a new model, N versus N1, the person in front of you, treat them like a human being. What would you do for, like, I'm going to get out of the therapist end of things right now and just say, Anthony, what would you do if you had a person in front of you who had major pain or chronic pain, right? They have all these different variables in their life. They've been in pain for so long. They've been to 20 other practitioners and they're sitting in front of you crying and wondering what to do, right? Like, what do you do in that situation, right? Like, do you work by intuition or do you go with the research-based protocols, right? Like,
because if they've already been to 20 other people, they probably already went through the 20 other research-based treatments that you can probably give. Now, it's interesting because what you just helped me identify there was the problem on both ends, right? The problem on the end of not doing any level of research whatsoever, or being able to be like free whatever information, everything is valid, kind of perspective, is you get charlatans. You get people who are making baseless claims. You get people who are doing dangerous practices that could actually fuck someone up because they don't actually know the long-term consequences. You could have people who, are doing unsafe things. On the other hand, you can get people who are so rigidly ascribed to like not wanting to escape the scope of the standardized practice that even if they know that they have something in their tool belt that could help someone, they won't in that moment because it will put them outside of the scope of practice and it can make them feel liable. And you will get people who won't actually help other people because it's not aligned with the standardized acceptable mode of practice. And those are two dangerous, that is a dangerous thing where people are not being helped because it's outside the scope of what's deemed acceptable, even if it is completely and totally effective and anecdotally you've seen it work and it could actually really help this person. Well, then now you're doing harm. The do no harm thing is like, it's always, you're only the hero long enough to, unless you live long enough to become the villain sort of thing. It's one of those situations.
Yeah. It's a tough one, right? Because, how do I put this? Like, you have a person in front of you, right? And what type of care do you want to give them, right? Like the research-based paradigm of having, a diagnosis, there must be something wrong with the person, an ailment, and that itself is dualist, right? That's already narrowing down the possibilities within your head in a box, right? But again, it's for safety. It's for, you have to teach hundreds of thousands of therapists one thing to do, which is not easy, right? Like, or I don't know how many therapists are out there, but, operating off the same, if we add chiros, physios together, osteopaths, even massage therapists in there, who are working with people on the ground with their hands and people in pain, it probably totals hundreds of thousands, right? How do you get them to a standard of care that's not going to hurt somebody, that's going to keep you safe, risk wise for litigation, and have a operation of standard of care that will help a lot of people, right? And then you have the trainers on the ground who don't really have this in their head, right? Like they don't operate under that model. They're just like, I want to get this person jacked. And there's so many different, like, there's so much charlatanism out there with both like therapy and personal training that it's hard. Like that's the other end of the spectrum. That is the downside of an open system. But then you really do have to have the people like us, in my opinion, who are the ones that sort things out for everybody. Where is the gold? Where is the good information? And sort things out. And the consumer has to come to care too. Just like the therapist has to care that there's a person in front of them and they may not fit the research-based RCT, even if their twin was in the study, okay? Even if they, like, not everybody fits that, and likely the person in front of you doesn't fit that, okay? So how do we go from the research-based study to the person in front of you on the therapist end, and then how do you avoid charlatanism on the ground? And the answer for most of the research-based clinicians, again, or the people who are espousing the research is follow the research as it's currently there right now. And that's the trust element. Trust me, we'll fix it. I have a trust that we'll fix it.
So when trust erodes and you get into a model crisis, because that's what a model crisis is an erosion of the trust of the current model.
Yes.
And you can no longer trust the principles that you're operating on. How do you make it from a model crisis to a model shift, or that paradigm change, the model revolution, I guess? What's the process there as outlined by Kuhn?
Well, I can't I haven't read that much Kuhn. I've only read Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and I've looked at a couple of his other works. So I can't say exactly what he said about that, but let's explore this ourselves, right? So we have what would make a scientific revolution right now. To me, it's when all the scientists agree on a new paradigm, a new set of rules to look at, right? We've basically proposed this. A lot of the rules are and we're talking specifically biomechanics right now. Okay. Back to, because I keep shifting from biomechanics to therapy. It might be a little confusing. I'm going to go back to applied biomechanics, or how I would fix biomechanics. I would stop using so much force velocity and looking at things in a force production capacity, because everybody's looking at athletics and being more explosive, better athlete. If you produce a better athlete, that's who your heroes are. And that's, if you get in with an athlete, then that's the way to go. I think we have to ditch this. I don't want athletes as in my utopia. I wouldn't want athletes in places of hero worship. Okay. They're to be looked at as movers, but unless they actually have something intelligent to say, why put them as heroes? So like, that's a cultural thing. I think the hero should be like Nikola Tesla, not Elon Musk, but I like Elon too. I'm talking, scientific heroes, Newton, Tesla, Steinmetz. Those are my guys, right? So I like them, right? And if we had more of that, there would be a better culture. We wouldn't be having to look at athletes talking about scripted, they're getting scripts. They don't even know what they're talking about. They're like, I'm going to lunch right now. Okay, say this. Okay, cool. And then everyone's like, oh, Michael Jordan said that, right? Enough of that, okay? Enough of looking at force velocity, enough of the one move explosive, enough of the 100-meter, 50-meter runs. Even though, again, I put them on my stories because I love the movement. I love the movement, but I don't like the theory of using them as the heroes. So yeah, again, back to scientific revolution. I think we must go back to a person-centered approach when we're looking at therapy with biomechanics. We need to ditch having to make force production so hot. You know what I mean? Like, right. Even it's barbell training, it's lifting, it's force production, it's all that, and put it more towards what are we actually observing, and how can we help people age gracefully throughout life? That's more along the lines of and espousal and allowing in mechanical principles, not just research-based studies. Now, I'm not saying that the research-based people go against mechanical principles, but they definitely don't espouse them that much. The only one I'm seeing is Andrea Spina, right? Or like in a major way anyway. ATG does this as well. And even Goda and Weck do it too. But I'm talking within the mainstream. I would say Andrea Spina is the only one doing it. And I wouldn't even say his stuff is mainstream. I still think it's looked a little bit outside of the research base.
It's
a
like little fringe, yeah.
Nobody wants to touch him because he's super smart, right? But and he's got his boys behind him who have the research review service. These guys are very, very intelligent. That's why they're not touched, right? Like, I don't think that they take a lot of the heat that other people would, because they are, they have the academic credentials behind them, but they are working a lot on mechanical principles, not exactly hard research that's there for them to touch. And again, back to picking out the research that's already in a pool of current research. That's what everyone's doing. Everybody is doing that already. And that was the point that I made back in the Naughty episode when I was saying Gray Cook. That was a bad example. And by the way, I don't use Gray Cook's anything to do with Gray Cook. He was the first person that I actually came upon, but I don't use any of his models. I don't really like them. The step over is too simplistic. I think I was strawman in saying that I did use them. I don't. So yeah, back to it. Basically, having to use more observation as well, because we have a pool of data just not being used right now. And that's where Go shines, right? They're like, we are making a culture of using slow motion technology. And again, slow motion used as a way to draw upon information from thousands of videos that are currently there is different than 3D kinematics in a lab in a controlled setting. These are two different things. They can be used differently. They're not against each other. It's a straw man, or not even a straw man, a red herring to put them against each other. They can both be used. But again, if you don't acknowledge that, what you're seeing in observation on the models, then your 3D motion capture isn't doing all that it could. You're not using the technology because your theory is stopping you using the technology.
You need to start looking for different things. And that's ultimately the point about, the 3D kinematic technology being in a controlled environment too, versus making hundreds, if not thousands of observations of slow motion video in different environmental contexts and still seeing consistency among all these different variables. That's significant. We've been saying this the whole time. We've been defending the validity of using slow motion as a correct way to observe data. Again, there's you can sure argue about what you're actually seeing, argue about what the implications of what you're seeing are, but at least acknowledge that seeing it is worth something. And on that note, guys, we're gonna wrap up this episode. We could have gone a lot longer, and we're going to continue to go a lot longer. We'll be back on Thursday for another solo episode to continue this conversation. Today was about the Kuhn cycle, which is the pre-paradigm to normal science, to model drift, to model crisis, to model revolution, all the way up to a paradigm change within the scientific field. And this is kind of what we're seeing. We believe that we're in a model crisis in movement and in functional fitness and in fitness in general, because there are so many different paradigms that are coming forth that are challenging the first principles of the current models and the current assumptions of mainstream biomechanics and the normal science of how the body works and how the body moves fundamentally. If you guys want to learn more information about how we view some of the models, some of our earlier episodes about the feet, about walking, about locomotive mechanics, those are really good resources because we go really, really in depth. We go over the former or current models of normal science, and then we talk about where we think they're wrong. So if you want to kind of do a review, some of our early episodes, they're still up there. They're on YouTube, they're on Spotify, they're on iTunes. Go check them out. We'll be back on Thursday live on nofilter.net if you want to check it out. If you're watching on YouTube, like, comment, subscribe. Let us know what you agreed with, what you didn't agree with. We always love hearing from you. And you can follow me at The Body Moves on Instagram. Will is at The Art of Move. We'll catch you on the next episode of The Art of Move podcast.
Have a good one, guys.